Okay, so welcome everybody to the Infrastructure Committee this morning. We're just going to proceed through the agenda, so apologies. I have Stephen Dunn at the moment. I've no other apologies at this moment in time. So declarations of interest to remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interest which might reasonably be thought by others to influence their approach to the matter under consideration. Any members who have interest to declare in relation to today's business should do so now or when the particular matter arises in the meeting. So does any members have any declarations of interest to declare? No. Okay, chairperson's business. I suppose it's just to say at the outset of the meeting this morning, sadly we have 2 fatalities on the road this morning in terms of A5, and our sympathies and our thoughts go with those families this morning who have lost 2 young people, which is very sad news. And I know obviously in the committee we're looking at road safety. So going forward, you know, we will be looking at this issue, but it is very sad news this morning. So we send our sympathies to the families. At item 4 is the draft minutes, and at page 6 you'll see the draft minutes of proceedings for the meeting on the 24th of April 2024. So I just seek agreement that members are content that the minutes are a true and accurate reflection of the meeting on the 24th of April 2024. If so, I'll indicate, or if so, I'll sign the minutes.
Consent, Chair.
There we go. So item 5 is the matters arising. At page 16 you'll see the outstanding request for response, so I'm just asking members to note if you're content. Content. Okay, at page 22 we've the correspondence memo, and at page 24 we've response from Cycle, I think I'm pronouncing that right, suggesting that the committee holds a dedicated session on active travel to investigate why targets are repeatedly not met, and that it might be beneficial for this to coincide with Bike Week, the 10th to 16th of June. Cycle have also offered to meet with the committee to discuss the issues. So I remind members that the committee received a briefing from the Transport and Road Asset Management Group on the 28th of February. However, we really didn't discuss active travel in any great detail during that. I know that that was quite a wide-reaching type of engagement and briefing that we received. So I'm just seeking members' views on proceeding with that in terms of requesting an oral briefing from the Transport Road Asset Management Group on active travel to coincide with Bike Week, subject to officials' availability obviously. And I suggest that maybe the committee may also want to take the opportunity to hear from Sustrans on the issue. So I'm just seeking any views, or sorry Peter, I know you're just coming in there, but I'm just seeking any views or agreement in relation to that.
Apologies, Chair, I'm a little bit late. No, I think that's a great idea, combining them, to bring them in to give us really good knowledge about what's going on within the sector.
Yeah. And we'll also be aware just with the active transport budget and that type of thing as well, so it might be useful to look at some of that just in a wee bit more detail if you're content. Yeah. Okay, so again, just seeking agreement to respond to Cycle outlining the actions agreed today. So I think we're all content with that, yeah?
Great, yeah.
Okay. So at page 24 as well, there's correspondence from Regen responding to a committee request for more detail outlining how Regen's work aligns with the remit and work of the committee. The matters outlined in the correspondence actually fall within the remit for the Committee for Agriculture, Environment, Rural Affairs and the Committee for Infrastructure. So I'm just going to seek agreement to advise Regen that the Committee for Agriculture, Environment, Rural Affairs and the Economy Committee would probably be the most appropriate committees to consider these issues. Are you content? Yeah? Okay. And then I just want to seek agreement lastly to all the remaining actions as per the correspondence memo. All content?
Right.
Okay. So we're now moving on to item 7, which is the review of the taxi operators licensing regulations, Northern Ireland 2012, Department for Infrastructure, oral evidence. At page 31, you'll see the clerk's memo, review of the taxi operators licensing regulations, Northern Ireland 2024. At page 36, you'll see the Department for Infrastructure review of taxi operator licensing regulations, Northern Ireland 2012. Which is written evidence, and at pages 40 you'll see the official report of the taxi sector issues licensed taxi operators association. So again, I'm just seeking agreement from members that the evidence today is recorded by Hansard. All content with that?
Right.
Welcome to the committee today. It's great to see some familiar faces joining us again. So today we have Dr. Chris Hughes, Director of Safe and Accessible Travel Division, DFI. We've Dorcas Catrona, Safe and Accessible Travel Division, DFI. We've Donald Starrett, Safe and Accessible Travel Division, DFI. We have Stephen Spratt, Driver Vehicle Agency Enforcement. So thank you for joining the committee today. We're really grateful that you've taken the time to come to us and provide us with some information and evidence today. We obviously do have information that has been provided to the committee, so if you don't mind, if you give us a brief overview in a few minutes, and then I obviously want to come to members' questions on the issue, so I'll let you talk.
Chair, members, thank you for the opportunity to provide a briefing to the committee. As you said, I'll just introduce the team. So Dorcas looks after the taxi team on a day-to-day basis. Donald looks after the legislation across the division, and Stephen is from DVA, but just to dampen your enthusiasm, he has nothing to do with MOTs. So he won't be able to answer any questions of that.
That's sorted. Oh, what a
we had go with that yesterday. So we do all that. So I mean, I wasn't Chair. I wasn't going to do anything very extensive at all. Move quickly to questions. But what I was going to say that the role of DFI with regard to taxis is to provide regulation. So what we do is whenever you contact an operator to book a taxi, we make sure that that operator is properly licensed. When the vehicle appears at the door, we ensure that that has been checked and is at the correct standard. The driver is suitably qualified, and when you exit the vehicle, you're paying a fare that is regulated. What we can't do is control the economic cycle and control other issues that are reserved matters, for example, taxation. There are factors within which the taxi sector operates that are outside our control, so there's quite clear parameters. We're important and impactful players, but we're not the only things that make an impact on that. And Chair, that was all I was going to say, and just leave yourselves open to you for questions.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Obviously, you'll be aware some of the taxi operators came to the committee very recently, and they detailed about communication that had been sent from the department to themselves and one thing and another. But on a very simple, basic level, obviously, as a committee, we were aware that there was nothing really forthcoming imminently, and I take it that's still the case. So if you want to maybe chat to some of that.
I'm going to ask Donald to take that one.
In terms of the of regulations
coming
forward.
And any changes to the legislation or any updated legislation, if that makes sense.
That's grand. I mean, I suppose the immediate issue has been, and I think committee are already aware, in around the Uber judgment and subsequent rulings on that. And maybe if it's helpful, I can maybe give a wee bit of background on that.
Yeah.
So the Uber judgment and the rulings that flowed from that, it was initially really about, the case was brought by Uber workers, and they made the argument that they were workers rather than self-employed, and as such they were entitled to certain workers' rights. So that case obviously worked its way through as far as the Supreme Court. There were subsequent judgments flowed from that, but ultimately the courts decided that the drivers were workers, and that was primarily because of the level of control that Uber exerted over what they did. So in other words, the drivers weren't entirely free to make their own decisions. And that's flowing then from that. There became an issue around VAT and whether or not the taxi fares should be subject to VAT. The decision was taken that looking at the legislation, that the taxi operators were in contract with the passengers, and that there was a contract in place there, and that had potential to alter the VAT situation. That, as I say, was initially taken in Uber, but in terms of the legislation that functioned in London. Subsequently, courts have found that it's likely to be the same across England and Wales, and indeed, while this hasn't gone to court yet, our own advice is that our own Taxis Act here in Northern Ireland is on the same level. In other words, across the UK, basically, there is similarity in terms of the primary legislation that governs taxis. So when you boil that down, basically, the Taxis Act provides for a contract between the operator and the passenger, and that the operators are effectively working under that contract. The regulations then that the department, as you know, we've written out to taxi operators, and there was a proposal there that we would need to change the legislation. What that would do, were we to bring forward those regulations, they would simply clarify what the Taxis Act already provides for. So we can't make regulations that change that. The regulations are subordinate to the Act, so the only thing they can do is to implement the Act or to clarify its requirements. So in this case, we would be clarifying the requirements of the Act. However, as committee, again, we'll probably know there's a VAT consultation has been launched by Treasury, and that basically is trying to understand the impact of these court rulings on the taxi industry. So first of all, to understand, and then to consider possible ways of mitigating the impact of that. So with that in mind, the Minister, having considered that consultation being underway, he has decided not to bring forward the regulations at this point in time. However, the one thing, sorry for this being long-winded, but the one thing I would say about that is that even though we're not bringing forward the regulations, it doesn't alter the fact that the Taxis Act is already there, and that it provides for the contract between operator and passenger. So I think the department would be encouraging concerned operators, and we understand that concern, to take their own legal advice. But effectively, I suppose what we're saying is that this issue flows from the decision of the courts rather than any decision taken by the department.
That's useful. Thank you for that, because it does provide a wee bit of clarity just in relation to things as well. So obviously, in terms of that communication, what proportion, of drivers does the department estimate would have been aware then of those proposed changes arising from that communication? And then when you look at, for example, drivers not aligned with taxi operators and how communication would have maybe got to them. So can you maybe talk a wee bit to that in terms of how many drivers would have become aware of that through that communication?
The information notice went out to all. DVA actually issued it through their licensing system, and it went out to all taxi operators that are registered with DVA, and they were to, obviously it has the biggest impact on operators, but it was to be circulated through their employees as well.
And also, there's no taxi drivers that aren't affiliated to an operator. You know, if you're driving a taxi, you need to be affiliated to an operator. So that independent that doesn't exist if you're driving.
There would be a number of driver operators, you know, who are sort of just one-man band, so
But
to
then
speak.
they've got it because they're registered as an operator on the DVA system, so they've got it themselves.
They would
so,
have got that.
So every driver is affiliated to an operator, and all operators were communicated with, and then asked to distribute that to anybody who was affiliated to them.
Including the likes of Uber and people like that.
Yes.
Any operator,
Yeah.
any operator that has a license that is on the DVA records will have received. And
possible.
I checked with them twice that they sent it out and they confirmed with me that they had. So
I'm going to say it's possible in some cases it may take a while to filter through because we're obviously reliant on DVA will be reliant on the information that they've been provided. So if that becomes out of date or whatever, it could take a
And do you have any exact figures in relation to the communication? In terms of how many it would have went to?
well, it went out. I have the number of operators.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the number of operators.
Yeah. So I can provide that.
Yes.
We have 1,123 operators. That's at Q3, so that would have been around the time when that went out. So it went out to all those operators.
Okay, thank you. And then just lastly for me, just on some of the VAT element of things, what assessment has the department made about the potential impact of VAT on the sector, particularly on smaller operators? Because that was a concern that had been raised here at the committee.
Not something we're really in a position to do because the VAT implications, and to be honest, I think even Treasury are still trying to understand the implications of this. It will vary according to operating models because the department obviously doesn't mandate a particular operating model for the industry, so it will vary according to that model. But I suppose we are aware that I think the VAT threshold is £90,000, and while the VAT fell on drivers for the most part, the vast majority of those would have fallen below that VAT threshold. We are aware that things will change, but as I say, it's not something that we would have any information on, and certainly the departments and Minister is very happy to look at any ways of trying to mitigate against this, but it is something that it wasn't of the department's making. Likewise in Britain, it wasn't. It all stemmed from this court ruling about the VAT implications and about where the contract actually lay.
So, just in the course there of what you were saying, has the department looked at any ways of mitigating some of that in terms of, seeking ways through legislation to move the contract from the operator and passenger to the driver and passenger, so to avoid VAT?
I think one of the key issues on this is that the operators obviously they have a particular system which the drivers implement for them. Were that to be radically changed, we would need to be in a situation where those drivers were totally self-employed and therefore not controlled by an operator. Now, whether operators would be content with that scenario, because there's implications, for example, for what fares would be charged. At the moment, an operator will set their fare structure. They would need to relinquish. That's just one example, but for the contract, for the driver to be truly viewed as self-employed following this court ruling, it would have very major implications for the operating models, and that's why we're saying really to to the operators that they need their own legal advice on their particular operating model, because that's not mandated by the department.
So, in further to the question, Chair, the issue is that tax, as you're well aware, is a reserved matter. So this is Treasury and HMRC. So they control this and they do that. So the options available to the taxi team and DFI to impact on reserved matters of taxation, that's not something that the system is set up to do. That is a HMRC reserved matter, and the courts have taken decisions and views. Donald set out what changes might possibly look like, but ultimately this is a HMRC and Treasury matter, which they have done, and the courts in GB have ruled on. So these are the larger forces at work that.
So quick supplementary to that before I go to members. Then in relation, obviously we know it is a reserved matter, and I thank you for pointing that out, but in terms of the department engaging on this issue with Treasury, has there been quite substantive engagement then on this with Treasury, or has there been any discussions between the department or relevant departments at Whitehall on it?
There has been very limited engagement on it, in that it, as Chris has said, it is Treasury and the Department for Department for Transport in GB that have taken the lead on this, and they have just really advised us that when the consultation went live, and asked us if we would forward that information out to operators and encourage operators to feed back through the consultation.
Yeah. We've also drawn this, but literally only this week, to the attention of the Department for the Economy, just to make them aware of the issue, because it's an employment matter. So we have drawn it to their attention to make them aware just of all of this issue that's going on within Northern Ireland. So
okay. Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks
very much for coming in for the answers so far. I just want to follow up firstly on this point around that, because you said that there's a consultation now going live and that's been disseminated to members of taxi operators. But we heard 2 weeks ago from the Taxi Operators Association the real and stark impact this could have on the sector here. What I took from that was that the bigger will probably get bigger, but they said they'd probably have to go to a cashless process, which would be deeply concerning, particularly for the elderly and for vulnerable who wouldn't have the facility. But outside of the major cities and the major companies, the smaller firms just said they wouldn't be able to take this on, and the impact of that would be vast, and that there would be less operators in Northern Ireland and as a result less taxis. So with that in mind, is there a plan for the department to respond to the consultation, seeking evidence from the taxi operators here to make that point? Because those impacts could be even more stark here than they would be elsewhere in the United Kingdom.
It's for operators to voice their view.
I appreciate that, but is the department planning to respond?
Because we hadn't.
No, we were just encouraged to make our local operators aware of the consultation, and for any issues for them to draw out in a consultation.
So a lot of what you've described there is matters of employment practice and employment legislation and employment law, and those are not areas that, as I said at the outset, our role is to regulate the taxi that appears at your door and the driver within that taxi, and how it was booked. So there are forces at work here that are much larger than we are able to impact on.
Would the department as a whole not be concerned about the impact on the amount of operators we would have here, and as a result, would there not be a plan it would carry a lot more weight than single operators if the department could come up with a coordinated joint response to this, to submit the Treasury and His Majesty's Government? Is that not something that's being considered?
So at this stage, what we'd done was draw attention to that. We could certainly have a look and see if that was appropriate. To be honest, I'd need to see if we could actually, because of the issues tend to be employment law, and I'd need to have a think if we could actually make a constructive and meaningful. I don't know. I'd need to have a think about that.
Okay.
Because within the parameters within which we work, those things that you describe, cashless, that's issues which are very much a matter for the operators and the businesses. Those are business, and they're real issues. And we do, of course, and just to be very, very clear, we do, of course, want to make things as easy for operators to operate within. This is, we want there to be as many well-functioning.
Yes.
That is absolutely what we want to do and play our role in part of that. 100%. That's the page we're on. So we are not doing anything that is within our gift. that is actually going to cause any problems to the operating model. A lot of this stuff is subject to the larger forces that are the economy and our HM Treasury and employment law. Those are the factors which really seem to be impacting on this. So just to be clear, that's...
I think as Chris has said too, it's just this week we've made contact with economy. They were aware of the issue, and it's possible that through further engagement there that other actions may emerge from that process, but it's too early really to...
It is, and we've only really just... This is a developing situation, so we've let people know this week. So, I think what's incredibly helpful is for the businesses to alert and make their so, and that is something that we have encouraged, because that is who Treasury are seeking views from. So that's... And we're helping that as much as we possibly can.
No problem. If we could move on, Chair. In terms of the amount of taxis on the road at the minute, we've heard again that has reduced down significantly, but one of the major concerns with that too is the of accessibility taxis and those that can have wheelchair access and etc. It's now less than 5% and it seems to be dwindling year on year. I'm just wondering what the department's view on that is and what more could be done in your eyes to get more fully accessible vehicles on the road.
There's currently 350 accessible taxis across Northern Ireland, and yes, I agree that the numbers have been decreasing. We're very aware of that. Under the current legislation, the department doesn't have any kind of input. It's at the drivers' and operators' discretion how many accessible taxis they have in their fleet. We would regularly meet with my team met recently with with MTAC and Disability Action, so we would, kind of just have regular engagement with those stakeholders and their disability groups, and encourage them to engage with operators and. Just engage with operators to kind of, pass on what their issues are, because what the department can do practically is, it's again what Chris has said within the licensing process, and that we can't enforce operators to have wheelchair accessible taxis.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I'm glad that you share my concerns. I suppose what I do have a concern about is at what stage would it have to get to before somebody would have to step in and try to force operators' hands? 350, only 50 taxis with full accessibility for the whole of the country is virtually nothing, realistically.
That'd be political.
There is a Section 75 impact almost in that, because people need access to taxis and they can't get them. So at what stage do you think something might need to be done to try and either incentivise or to at least have a certain percentage of these taxis that are out there through operators at having that full accessibility?
That would be a political decision.
So ministerial decision?
I think that would be a political decision if you wanted to alter the arrangements that are currently there. If you wanted to change, and actually make a requirement, that would absolutely be a political decision.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, last one, Chair. I promise it is my last one. In terms of speaking to drivers regularly, whether it's those seeking to come on as new taxi drivers or those who are just going through the process again, I hear regularly that the driving test and the entire process for becoming a taxi driver is not only laborious, it's expensive and not fit for purpose. I'm keen to get your take on that. From a process, and are there any plans to amend it, taking on board the advice and the feedback you get from drivers? I appreciate some of the bigger firms are now running academies to get people through, but I think that gives you some idea of how laborious the process is, that they've had to employ people to take new drivers through, and where they're doing that there is some success, but in other areas people just give up. Be interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so just to give a sort of a bit of a background too, so the taxi theory test was introduced in 2014, and the idea was to professionalise the sector. And at that stage, there were a lot of people who would have had taxi licences, and this was welcomed by the sector. The drivers were very keen on introducing and professionalising the sector, and it was anticipated that actually as time went on, those who were driving more casually, and perhaps whenever there was a downturn in the economy and a job that they had was not providing as many hours, they could have supplement their income by doing some taxi work. So the taxi drivers who were doing the taxiing as a full-time job were very keen on the professionalisation of the sector. That brought it in line with other driving jobs. So, for example, HGVs and buses have a similar approach to this, and actually the driving test itself is set at what's called a level 2 standard qualification, which some of you may be familiar with, but that is, so level 2 is an internationally recognised standard, which is what has currency in the workplace. So if you get a C at GCSE, that's a level 2 qualification. If you get a D or below at GCSE, that's a level 1 qualification. And if you go into the workplace, employers are looking for level 2. They're looking for 5 GCSEs, including English and Maths, if you want to join most workplaces. Level 2 is the standard that this is pitched at. Bus drivers are pitched at level 2, HGV drivers are pitched at level 2. The taxi driver test is a level 2 qualification as well. It is exactly the same level. However, it actually has lower pass marks than those other test marks, which has taken it down. So there's been a number of changes made to the test over the years in response to concerns that have been raised with that. So for example, if you want to pass the test for cars and bikes, you need 86%. For buses and lorries and driving instructors, you need 85%. For taxi driver, you need 80%, which keeps it at level 2, but actually is still sitting at that level. In 2017, December, there's 4 parts to it, and the pass mark for each bit was reduced to 18. Now, obviously, you have to score higher than that to compensate to get your 80, but actually, if you display that level of competence, so that has been reduced from 19 and is actually 20 in those other tests. So that has been reduced. In September 2018, the hazard perception element of the test, the pass mark for it, was reduced from 57 to 50. On NI Direct, there are now practice papers on online tests. There's improved preparation materials, and there's been an English voiceover added for those who don't have English as a first language or struggle with the reading aspect of the tests. In September 22, that material was reviewed and updated, and now candidates who fail the tests have enhanced signposting to tell them exactly which aspects of the test they need to do, which they need to gen up on, because that's the aspect that they failed on. So from the department side, there has been an immense amount of work over quite a few years to make this test as accessible as possible. The key, I think, is, so this is a level 2 standard. It has to be at that standard, and it has to be, so that a level 2 test has both a depth of knowledge and a breadth of knowledge. And that is what this test does, in the same way as it does for HGV and other drivers. The simple, honest answer to this is that drivers or test applicants tend to fail on those bits of the test which are the knowledge based to do with the highway code and interacting with customers. The materials that are available online, they don't reproduce in test conditions, and they don't demonstrate an understanding of actually those requirements for the job of a taxi license, so they're not meeting the standard. Now, the adverts that are running and stuff demonstrate that with more preparation, people can actually get to the standard. So it's a bit like, I had a former role which was encouraging pupils to get good GCSEs, including English and Maths. And if you got a D in your GCSE Maths, that's great because you're very close. Now go in and study a bit more and get the standard. So it's about the preparation. So we have done a lot. We have listened over a number of years to this, and we have responded to that. But we also have to be custodians of the fact that this is an internationally recognised standard, which needs to be comparable to other driving jobs. So.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that clarity. Cahill?
Thank you, Chair. You're welcome back. Thank you. No, just now that John has seen my notes, I'll have to go a different direction. Thanks very much for that, John. Last year there was a maximum tariff introduced, and the department stated that it was taken in the context of challenges about the availability of taxis, particularly in the evenings and the weekends. So my question is, has the division assessed the industry following this change?
You're talking about the higher rate in the evening times. Well, we have no means to, have actual statistics to see. However, sort of anecdotal kind of evidence back to us has suggested that there are more drivers in the evening time. Just sort of general feedback we've had from some operators. They have said that they have up to maybe 30% more drivers available at weekends and evenings, particularly at weekends.
And is there any indication that you will be able to monitor that, or is it work? I was saying it's working on the ground, or is there any other challenges?
Yeah, we have. I work in the policy section, so
Right,
there
okay.
is kind of no sort of statistical means to that, and so we would just, through our engagement with taxi industry, just asked.
It's only been 5 months, and
No,
it was so.
I
There
just
was
want
a,
to obviously.
we don't sort of and this is a question that's come up before, and it's a very legitimate one, and I absolutely
And it's
understand.
just, it was raised, obviously,
Yeah.
it was raised
Yeah.
part of the conversation, and it's just.
So we don't, we don't deploy people on a Friday or Saturday night to see what the situation is. We get that feedback, and members obviously will get feedback on issues like that through your offices and stuff like that. And we listen to that, but we don't actually go out and do that.
It's just in the context of the conversation we had with the industry.
Yeah.
So the other point I want to raise is the Class C taxis issues, and I definitely need you to elaborate on it. The division has stated that Class C is being used right now in a way that it wasn't originally intended. So can you comment on that, and how are Uber regulated in other jurisdictions? Because it raised its head in that conversation with Class C. So we'd just like to elaborate a wee bit on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, we are on record as saying that Class C isn't functioning as was originally intended. The original intention was that Class C would be for vehicles such as wedding cars, funeral cars, limousines, chauffeur-driven vehicles. That was the original intention. The description at Class C is described as, do I remember, applying for hire and reward, so or carrying passengers for hire and reward. That's what it is. So they can't. It's taxis on a pre-booked basis. Uber were one of the companies who have gone into that sector at the moment. That wasn't the department's original intention. However, I think in managing that situation now, whatever we do, if we do anything, we need to be mindful of the fact that I think that at the moment there are roughly 1,500 vehicles in Class C. Now, some of those will be your wedding cars, your funeral cars, etc. But some of them are taxis that are working day and daily. So whatever, were we to come up with a solution, it's very much a balancing act. We need to make sure that whatever we do, taxi numbers are already in decline. We don't want to make that situation any worse. So it's partly about understanding how serious and significant the issue is at the moment. I think, as we said earlier, we talked about what regulations the department was bringing forward, and at the moment we don't have any plans to amend Class C.
Right.
That's at this point in time.
Do you intend to have a conversation with the industry in respect to it? I mean, it's just it has been raised a number of times with a number of members. So
I think we have to. We obviously have to receive any criticism we get from the industry, and we're aware that the issue is there. That information is obviously received by the department. We can feed that back to the minister. But as I say, in terms of our action, it is a very difficult balancing act. It would be better if we weren't in that situation. Of course, it would. But we just have to accept that there are a number of taxis and legitimate taxis that are currently operating in Class C. What would happen to those if we forced to move from another to another class? We need to understand that issue.
okay, and just my final point, Chair. As part of the presentation we received, they presented 2 photos applying for PSV for 2 different taxi classes. One had passed the PSV, another failed. The presentation highlighted the different rules within the class itself. Are you able to comment on that? I think it was to do with maybe skirt board, or it was, or and heights as well. Yeah,
That is, and again, it's an illustration of the Class C it illustrates the fact that Class C was there more for the wedding vehicles, the funeral cars, certain novelty vehicles as well, and that is an issue because those dimensions are different for Class C at the moment. It does mean that certain taxis in Class C aren't subject to the same checks as others. And again, we do have to accept that. As a department, we're not aware that it's a significant issue or problem. There are certainly, as was illustrated a couple of weeks ago, there are certainly at least a small number of vehicles that are operating in Class C and potentially taxiing in Class C that aren't subject to exactly the same tests as the other classes. We can look at that, but at the moment we don't have figures to suggest it's a significant issue.
Thank you very much. Okay, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Danny?
Oh, thank you, Chair. A lot of what I was going to say was covered as well, and I'll just follow up on John's points around the Class B, the 350. I suppose, how much of a decrease have we seen over the last, say, 5 years?
I have, now my figures only go back to 2019-2020, and there was 499 taxis then, and then in quarter 3 of 23-24 it's down to 350.
Is there any indicator of why this is happening?
Well, obviously wheelchair accessible taxis are probably more expensive to buy and to operate and to run, so it's probably drivers are just choosing not to buy those types of cars because they are more expensive to operate. They're up before 2017. Operators were allowed to charge a little bit extra for a pickup, but then from 2017, under Disability Discrimination Act, everybody has to be charged the same. Disabled people are not allowed to be charged any additional charge compared to able-bodied people. So from that, really, the figures have sort of begun to drop.
It takes longer to safely and respectfully load and unload people, are on board and off board people who perhaps are a wheelchair user. So that takes time. So a vehicle will be stopped both at the beginning and at the end of a journey for a longer period than you would do for that. That is a factor that we get reported back to us by those operators who have wheelchair accessible taxis.
Well, but it's important for accessibility and inclusivity. Then just the numbers of actual taxis then decreasing. How much have we seen that decrease?
All taxi classes?
Yeah, well, yeah, for the main taxis. The industry, you're saying like 30% increase at an 18, but what's 30% of depending on the number going into town? Just thinking about the nighttime industry.
Like 30% when I mentioned like being available at the weekends, 30% more drivers being available at the weekends. Most of the drivers that are available at weekends are Class A.
Yeah.
And that's across Northern Ireland. There are 5,218 taxis in Class A, but obviously Class B operate in there as well. So there's the 350, and then potentially Uber as well. So Class C sitting at 1,497.
What's our decrease, say, since 2019?
So if you look, just to give...
All right, from 20...
So if you look at sort of the back end of the COVID pandemic, so at the end of the last quarter, the start of 2022, that was the low point for the number of taxi licenses. Mm-hmm. So there was 6,700 at the start of 2022, and that has now gone up to 7,100. So after steadily decreasing from 2019, this is the taxi vehicle licenses. So there are actually now been, over the past few quarters, there have been increases in the number of licensed taxis on the roads post-COVID. So that's the licenses if you look across all the classes.
Would you have the numbers of what it would have been, say, 2014? What it was before the changes?
Not with us. No, I'm not sure our records go back.
I think our records. I think the record, there was an issue with how the records were kept. So the figures from the start of first quarter of 2019, I think, were collected on the basis that I can check, but I think that's why we have the figures we have. And there was definitely a drop. Yeah. at that.
It might actually been useful to get some of those figures, you know, before COVID and that type of thing as well. I know you're saying there that there might have been an issue around how some of it was recorded, but it would be good to
Before
try and
COVID,
compare.
we can get some, but not a long time scale. But we can certainly see what we can produce. Absolutely.
DVA publish the figures every quarter, so we have a table here to hand. But if anybody, those tables are actually on our DFI website, and they're easy accessible.
Easy to find.
Yeah.
How far do they go back?
They go back to 2019, 2020. The ones that I have here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so might even be useful if we could, because it's going back just to 2019. It might be useful just to get some of those figures if we can.
Yeah.
Just before that. So, Keith.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for coming along. My question, you're not going to get off the hook today, Stephen. It's it's about enforcement, obviously broadly, and illegal operators and the industry. A few weeks ago, we were in and they sort of indicated, and it's very much a guesstimate. Urban, they talked about 25%, but to be fair, it was a guesstimate. And rural, they talked about possibly 40 to 50% illegal taxi operators. Can you sort of give us an understanding of what you do in enforcement and how that goes about, and how many's in your team, and how often do you be out?
Surely, I can, surely. I suppose starting off with resources, we're resourced at this moment in time for 9 full-time, dedicated, highly trained enforcement officers. And those officers can also be supported by up to 15 staff from other enforcement teams. And that works extremely well, especially during the likes of the nighttime economy. It's outside normal hours, so we can bring these staff in to supplement that team. Budgetary pressures remain a challenge, like every department. And for that reason, we have spent a lot of time thinking about innovative ways to try and improve what we do, what service we deliver, and how we go about it. And there's a couple of things I will mention to you that we've done. The first is, about 6 months ago, we decided to develop a piece of software. We call it the Street Hawk. And it was to provide officers with the ability to access really good, clean data around all vehicles. So you could tell the difference between a Class C, because there's no extremities on it to say that it is a taxi from a normal unlicensed car. To be able to screen the vehicles and to be able to identify from a street level, no matter what provincial town it is, issues that might be presenting as suspect taxis. And the other thing that we did was we retrofitted 7 of our enforcement vehicles with new specialist lighting to make them look less utilitarian. And they're running under a trial with siren as well. And the reason for that is that it means that we can step back from maybe having to rely so much on the likes of police to support some of those operations. It gives us more flexibility and makes us more agile in the way that we go about it. If you're asking me about illegal activity, I think it's very difficult, to be honest, to gauge across the province what that looks like as a pattern, rural versus urban. I would say that we would define illegal taxis now in 3 categories. The first is the total unregulated taxi that operates in direct competition with the legitimate licensed sector. These may be drivers who maybe hold a taxi driver's license but decide they don't want to be baggaged with the other running costs. It may be drivers that have lost a good repute and that type of thing. There's then these social unregulated taxis, and I think in fairness this has maybe been born out of the like of COVID. It's maybe been born out of the like of the cost of living increase, where you now have young people in particular offering taxi services at weekends for their friends and their family. And they may share the transport and somebody does it every weekend. Remuneration is possible under car sharing, but unfortunately you'll see by social media a lot of them are actually out there almost touting, I'm doing lifts this weekend, can you do X, Y and Z? And then there's the regulated taxis that step outside the confines of the licensing regime itself. And just picking up on some of the threads of discussion earlier there, it often arises during the late time nighttime weekend economy, and we have plenty of experience of drivers deciding to switch off their data heads, go independent, tout on the street. And you're probably aware of a lot of the media reports that were made in the run up to Christmas and indeed into the new year about price gouging, that it was totally unacceptable. And when it comes to looking at all of those types of issues, we have an operational planning group meeting once a month where strategically we look at all that information and set some strategic direction on what we need to do. And then we have a service delivery group which looks at how best to deliver that in that regard. So that's sort of a wee bit just of a flavour around how that happens. The key to this is that, you know, all the complaints that come into the system, and I'm going to give you some flavour of what that looks like in a second, but we use a risk matrix. We have a team that look at all that information and they provide on a scale of 1 to 10 how high that is as a priority. And I can assure you that any taxis that come in, whether they're regulated, unregulated, whatever, and there's identifiable immediate risk to the public, or indeed there is an immediate risk to road safety, that is top of the pops in terms of our response to that. So hopefully that will give you some comfort in that regard. In terms then of dealing with infringements at the roadside, we have teams which combine technical and non-technical staff. So they can deal with the roadworthiness part of it, they can deal with the licensing part of it. And we have over 50 fixed penalty tickets, for example, available at the moment to deal with all of the mire of offences that can potentially arise connected with taxiing. And we can also report, in certain circumstances, the more severe cases with a view to prosecution. And we can also seize those vehicles which are an immediate risk as well. And of course, prosecutions to preserve for the most serious. We don't want to be compounding the criminal justice system with lower level infringements. I said I would share with you maybe just a little bit of insight around complaints. 2022, we had 102 complaints come into the section. And those were divided down into 59 where there was fingers pointed at potentially illegal bandit operators, and 43 pointed at the regulated sector, drivers doing things that shouldn't be doing. That dropped to 87 complaints in 2023. 35 on this occasion were unregulated, 52 related to the regulated sector. And this year we have up to March, these are calendar years by the way, up to March, 68 complaints, 28 were at unregulated and 40 were at regulated. Now, picking up on some of the discussion there around our enforcement response, I can tell you that preponderance of those 40 complaints related to price gouging and a response to those media pieces that were put into the public domain. And we had a particular concerted effort to try to address that. And using the Street Hawk app, using the new vehicles, we have had an increase in the number of criminal offences dealt with by about 400% from January to March, just through introducing this type of innovative approach. I'm aware as well that there was a recent Assembly question written, raised as well, about what did that look like in terms of a dynamic, you know, how many operations were being thrown into Belfast all the time. Belfast, you know, was getting the preponderance of your attention. Again, in 2022, there was 117 enforcement operations carried out. 76 of those were outside Belfast, 41 were inside Belfast. It was 124 then carried out in 2023, 77 outside Belfast and 47 inside Belfast. And we had 40 then operations carried out up to March this year, and there's 20 of those outside Belfast and 20 inside Belfast. So I don't know if that gives a sort of a rough outline or a broad outline of what that dynamic looks like in terms of what we do and how we deliver it.
I've got a quick couple of questions. If you go back on your 2022 figures, where you had 102, if I'm correct, and 59 yes. illegal.
Yeah.
So out of those 59 that were reports of illegal, obviously they're only reports, how many of those 59 did you investigate, and how many is off the road, and how many would be on the road today to those 59?
I don't have that.
So in other words, your success rate.
Yeah. Certainly what I can say is out of those 59 complaints that come in, they will be a range of complaints coming in from different areas. They'll have a slightly different dynamic to them. Some of them will be incredibly difficult to investigate, especially those social cars used by families and friends. And our authority to go in and to look under the radar and do all of that sort of more murky stuff becomes a challenge. We need to be proportionate in what we do. We need to be able to demonstrate that we'll stop those people, we've engaged with them and gone through the rigours of that. I don't have an overall picture, but what I can say is that during 2022 there were 6 vehicles that were of an immediate risk to public safety that were seized. Now, we can seize unlicensed taxis, but we don't seize them all. People who have allowed licences to lapse, for example, the vehicle can be seized. People who maybe have part of the picture where they're compliant and it's a case that they have not got a public service vehicle licence, we will not try to obstruct that process. So there's a judgment call made as to when and where you seize vehicles. Some of those cases are up before the court shortly in the Northwest, I believe next month. So, as I say, I can't break down into granular form, into detail, how many of those complaints were actioned where we have taken them off the road. Certainly some of them will have been. Some of them will be repeat complaints about the same operator. Some of them will carry forward into the next year. But again, I'll underpin the point is those vehicles that present an immediate risk to road safety, those that present an immediate risk to public safety, are dealt with on an immediate basis, and we will bring in the like of the police to support some of those operations as well.
Final point, quickly. So you've given me the 3 areas: totally unregulated, social unregulated, unregulated. From any taxi operators I talk to, it seems that you guys go off to the easy pickings. Now, I'm only referring on what I've been told. For the regulated guys, okay, and the irregulated guys or unregulated gets away.
Okay.
What would you say to them? Not to me. What would you say to them?
What I would say to them is, I would say that the relationship, first of all, between DVA enforcement and those legitimate traders has never been better. We have been delivering taximeter testing, and it was part of this innovative thinking where, as part of every taximeter test, we get the opportunity to do a compliance check at the roadside. And we use that as well to collect information and concerns at the roadside. We know that the work, for example, that was driven predominantly in Belfast because of the price gouging over Christmas, resulted in very favourable feedback from the industry, both from the public Class B operators and from private hire. And in fact, we were commended, if you want to call it that, for having changed the attitude of some of the drivers who were going rogue in the early hours in the morning, and who all of a sudden were coming through statistically at depot level to say we now have so many more drivers, over 30% more drivers now in the early hours of the morning, prepared to carry passengers that are properly booked through our system. But let me not try to dilute the fact that there remains a problem, and it's no different from England, Scotland and Wales. In fact, we were getting a lot of complaints for a while through the NI Direct portal because people further afield were using the Northern Ireland system to report illegal taxis. And I can assure you that that same dynamic that we have here exists in England, Scotland, Wales and in the south of Ireland as well.
Okay, thanks, Stephen.
Okay, can I just ask a very brief supplementary just in the back of that? You see, just in terms of that young people on Facebook touting or whatever, but it's young people on Facebook, who are asking their friends, if you need a lift home, and obviously all of that. I mean, how do you square that circle? I mean, how do you stop that?
I'll go back to your previous colleague. It is extremely difficult. There are certain arrangements around car sharing that may actually legitimise and allow some of that to happen. It's where it goes beyond the bounds of charging for the overall running costs for sharing the journey in the first place, where someone decides to go a step further and actually go out and start openly touting for business because it's filling their pockets. And it's that type of thing. We will do a lot of work at venues, watching for cars dropping off, and we've had some success in picking up the likes of payments at end of journeys and that type of thing. Yes, it is a problem. I don't have the breakdown in terms of how many social taxis sit within the confines of the unregulated in that unsocial category that would differentiate those that might have been within the realms of it's okay versus those that are not. Because it's down to how those charges are accrued, how the service is delivered, and we wouldn't know that unless we had that information at hand. And just from an abstract complaint basis, you wouldn't have that at that level.
Just to be quick millisecond, do you see if you catch somebody an unregulated taxi?
Yes.
And they're charged or whatever, or they're fined or whatever. Do you make the insurance company aware of that? So the individual A, for example, was caught?
Yes. No, we don't have a protocol for reporting that to the insurance company, but the good news is we are meeting shortly with the motor insurers database. We're hoping to have links to our Street Hawk app to do those insurance checks, and that'll be part of the overall brokering of that discussion. So it is something that we're mindful of. The same with modified cars. Exactly the same problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the team for coming along. I did also suppose to just record that sentiment that is out there across the industry, that it's the guys who play by the rules mostly and pay by the rules seem to get a much harder time than those that don't play by the rules at all. But I appreciate the difficulties and you've explained those. See, as regards the increasing number of taxis, I'm wondering then, does that reflect the improvements that have been made or amendments made to the testing process that you'd outlined earlier, Chris? How much of it has been driven, I suppose, by cost of living issues? If someone's mortgage is going up £200 or £300 a month, they're going to be looking for legitimate ways to generate more money into the household. And what has the department done to kind of get that positive message out there that there are a significant number, a bigger number of taxis out there now than was a couple of years ago? Because even now, the impact that real dearth of taxis has had on the nighttime economy in a number of places that I'm aware of, certainly in my own constituency, where people are traumatised by the wait that they had some night 2 or 3 years ago, that landscape has changed now, and it's safe to go out again.
So just to be clear, the increase is the number of vehicle licences, so there seems to be a bit of a lag behind that in the taxi drivers. Right. So just to be clear, there's an increase in the vehicles, which is a precursor indicator to licences coming along. So you touched on, so there were a number of issues there you touched on, and one of them is the cost of living issue and how do taxi drivers make a living. So I did look back at the employment in the broader. If you look at the information that's available through ONS, it's to do with transport and warehousing. And from the middle of 2014 to now, the employment in that sector has increased by 10%. It's gone from 29,000 to 32,000. Now, within that has not been reflected in people who are choosing to operate as taxi drivers. Within that, the taxi, that peaked during COVID, perhaps unsurprising. Yes. So these are people who are working for retailers, for large supermarkets who provide delivery services. It peaked at 36,000 and it's now down to 32, but it's still 10% higher. The way that people are remunerated for coming into the industry is through the review of taxi fares. That is specifically pitched to provide a wage which is equivalent to people doing other driving jobs. So, and currently the latest fare rise was to provide an annual salary for a taxi driver of £27,200. So that is what a taxi driver is pitched to earn after the latest taxi fare rises. They can get that equivalent money because it's pegged to it by driving for one of those other people who provide jobs in a similar industry. Now, if you are driving a taxi, you can have other expenses which you need to generate income before you can pay for. So you have to pay for your fuel. You have to pay for your depot fees. Now, depot fees can be up to £8,200. If you are HPing your car, you can have to HP your car, which is another £4,000 or £5,000 per year. You have to generate the income to do that. You have to pay your own insurance at £2,000, and all those costs need to be generated by you before you can then take your £27,200. In those other industries, the offer is that you turn up, you don't work on social hours, you're not dealing with vulnerable people. You actually turn up, you have your rota, you have your rota, you do your delivery, you've got regular hours, you know what the circumstances are. So the industry is competing with that. And so there is this, and that's what I was saying at the very start, Chair. The offer is, we operate within the context of the wider economy, and the economy has changed in that regard. You asked as well, what are we doing about? We don't do anything about advertising. Promoting the taxis are more available. That's our role as the regulators. So, yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Went out to play at when numbers were dropping. Do you know what I mean? And it was well publicised. It might not have been the department who was putting it out, but yes. but there is a role there. No, thank you. As regards the disability accessible taxis, so is it the view that BFI doesn't really have any role per se or responsibility in increasing provision, and therefore hasn't or isn't taking any action to increase provision? Because it had been contended previously that there was it the 2011 Transport Act Part 5 would allow the department to intervene in terms of the purchase, I suppose, of vehicles, but I know that increased costs apply to the running of it as well as the purchase.
Yeah, there is, under the Transport Act 2011, as you said, we certainly think that it could be an option to provide funding. However, it's like a first time use of the powers under that legislation. So for us to consider something like that, we would need to have legal advice, we'd need to have budget, we'd need to have policy development, and we'd need to have ministerial input approval. But certainly it is potentially an option, but we would need to go through a lot of steps.
The number of, and I don't know this for a fact, but I would presume that while the number of disability access taxis has been reducing, the number of people reliant on them has been increasing. I haven't the figures to back that, but I would imagine that to be the case. Class C, there's been a chat about Class C, and it was more on the Uber end of things, so I'll focus on the wedding and funeral car end of things. That I think from the off, well, in 2015 there was a sort of recognition that they don't really belong there. And I don't know, you'd mentioned, I think you used the phrase a couple of times, throw back to you, we just have to accept, but do we? I mean, what can be done to sort of clear out those anomalies in the absence, or while we await a full review of the Act? Is there scope? Because it might be okay for us to just accept something, but it's difficult for people working in those industries to accept that we're just accepting it.
In terms of the wedding cars,
yeah.
Yes, wedding cars, and again it was an Assembly decision back when the 2008 Act, going back as far as that, it was a decision that wedding cars should be regulated as taxis, a particular type of taxis, but as taxis, so they're not obviously subject to the entire taxi regulatory framework, but to certain aspects of it. So to drive a wedding car, you have to be a taxi driver, you have to come through the testing, driver testing process, and also the vehicle needs to be tested. Now the department has engaged fairly extensively with the industry. We're aware that they would wish to be regulated differently or possibly deregulated, but the one route that was explored, or that the industry asked us to explore, was to issue exemption certificates to exempt them from the requirements of the Act. The department didn't and won't go down that route from the perspective that the Taxis Act was introduced by the Assembly. The clear intention at that stage was to regulate wedding cars as taxis, and for us to issue an exemption certificate. Were we to do that, we'd be exempting the vehicle and we'd also be exempting the driver, so anyone could effectively drive a wedding car. Now, we know the vast majority of the industry there are legitimate and wouldn't be heading down that direction, but still, for us to issue exemption certificates and effectively wash away the requirements of the Taxis Act would be inappropriate. And I think to say also, even before the Taxis Act, wedding cars were regulated at that stage as public hire vehicles.
And it's right that there is regulation, but should the Assembly then express a view that they should be regulated differently, might that prompt the department to relook at this issue?
Certainly something we need to take back to the Minister. But
okay, well, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Before I come to Peter, just on the back of what Mark was saying in relation to the accessible taxis, I'm sure all of us in our offices, EA transport is becoming an issue, and in relation to taxi provision for children with either special educational needs or disabled, they are using the taxi route to provide that home to school transport. So it's even looking at issues like that in the round as well. If we're seeing a decrease of accessible taxi provision, but also an increase in the need for the likes of that, even that home to school transport. Just wondering, has there been any discussions even cross-departmentally? If you can quickly answer that, or...
There hasn't been any discussion departmentally. Transport, like for school transport for children with special needs, is really the Education Authority has responsibility for that, and they haven't engaged with us on that issue. It's really their responsibility for that.
Okay. Peter?
Thank you everyone for coming in. Just to touch on John's point earlier about theory tests. I mean, people have come to my constituency office and spoken about the laborious nature of the theory tests and things like that, and you've touched upon it already. I'm just wondering, just to work this out in my head, what the difference between the theory test for taxi drivers and just members of the public actually is. I'd be keen to know what that is. And you mentioned a stat in your answer earlier about the hazard perception test. The pass mark had been reduced, and in my head I was thinking, surely that's one of the most important parts, because people, it's not knowledge based, it's people, they're looking at a screen and they're seeing the hazards in front of them. Just in my mind, that didn't really make much sense. So can you elaborate on that? And then to touch loosely on Mark's question there about the wedding and funeral lobby, I think to reiterate what he said as well, I think that exemption status might be helpful. Is that something that might be looked at within the review of the Taxis Act? They've spoken to me recently and said that it's having a real impact on them. So maybe if you could elaborate and tell me if you have any figures as to how many people that would potentially impact upon as well.
I didn't write those down, so I'll try and work my way through them. I'm sure you do me the kindness to remind me. So the taxi test, how does it compare with the driving test that you do for? So the taxi driver test looks at the specifics of the customer care element of the thing. It's broken down into 4 parts, which I shall try and dig out while I am talking to you. But basically, what it does is there's information on what the requirements of being a taxi driver are available on the NI Direct website. Those include customer care, eco driving, you can do optional first aid aspects of the. Have you found it there, Dorcas? What the 4 is? Disability awareness too. Disability. So they are. Thank you for digging that out. The questions are based on the areas set out in the taxi syllabus. So there is a taxi syllabus, and they include road safety, the environment, traffic signs and signals, customer care, disabled passengers, health and safety, legal responsibility and documentation. So those are aspects which won't be part of the normal driving test that you would do. So those are the specific elements that will be covered that would probably be above and beyond. Okay, that was one.
That's helpful to know that, just
Okay.
whenever I get further correspondence about that. But then you mentioned the statistic about the hazard perception test.
Yes.
And the reduction in I think the score that people needed to obtain.
Yes.
But in my mind, having done a theory test a number of years ago, that to me would have been one of the most important aspects.
Yes.
In terms of someone being on the road, seeing the hazards in front of them, knowing how to react, and telling during the course of the test, being able to say how they would react.
Yes.
What was the logic behind reducing that?
So it was to keep it as a level 2 qualification, and there was representations from the industry that this was too difficult. Sorry, I'm now going to do something I really try to avoid and give you an anecdote, which is that one of the issues about taxi driver, the hazard perception test for young people, is that if you are a gamer, you have to slow your reactions because your reactions are treated by the computer being that's far too fast, you couldn't possibly have reacted that quickly. Whereas if you talk to a teenager, they go, I would have been dead in my game if I had reacted that slowly. Now, taxi drivers tend not to fall into that category, but so it's still at the level 2, and actually it's one of the parts of the test that people were passing. So it was just an adjustment. When we looked at the test in the round, it was felt that that was still a reflection. And actually, because you have to have a driver's license for 3 years and be an experienced driver, people tend to do very, very well on the hazard perception test. The difficulty they have is in the other aspects of the testing. You asked as well about what does the testing regime you do in the morning. You do it in the morning. You go and you do the 4. So if you actually, if members are interested, and I did this recently, you can go on and do the practice test. There's 15 questions. You bang through. It's multiple choice, so you can do it. It's actually to engage with. It's actually quite straightforward. They give you a scenario, 4 choices. You pick which one it is, and at the end it tells you whether you were right or wrong. So for engaging with it, it's actually, you just do it online, you click a button, it's really quite, and that's all done at a time, and the theory test is then followed by the hazard perception test, and if you pass all that, you are then eligible to go along and book a practical driving test. So you have to go through those. So does that help answer?
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you very much. And then lastly, just on the wedding and funeral cars, do you have any figures in terms of how many operators there may be? I've met with people recently who have said that they're struggling to get access to the drivers in what is quite a niche area. So have any statistics on that?
We just have Class C. They fall under Class C, and there's around 1,500 cars. But in the wedding, in that there's Uber cars as well. So we don't have the difference between.
So I mean, one of the issues just you touched on there, drivers, is that drivers are dealing with people who will be in. I think the phrase is dressed not the way they would normally be. So they're in wedding gowns. They're in not top hats, but they're dressed not the way they would do to jump in and out of a taxi normally. People will be in footwear. People may well have had a Bucks Fizz for breakfast. You're dealing with people who are perhaps not as able to jump in and out of a taxi as they would have done. So there's a skill element of there's actually a passenger safety, a lighting, and getting in and getting out of the vehicle. You're also, as a driver, dealing with. I mean, there was that advert where the driver who braked slowly and the champagne in the back didn't still. It's actually you're carrying passengers and you're doing it as a commercial enterprise. So there's a skill set required for people who are who are dealing with that. It is a skilled offer that people have to the public.
Can I come in just a wee supplement?
Cahill was just.
No, I'm slightly different something, but that mark in first.
Yeah.
And you were chatting about the drivers here, but on the vehicles themselves, and we'd spoken about Class C around heights and things like that earlier. That applies in the instance of wedding cars and stuff too, where at the time of legislation, the big high Hummers that you see now weren't really on the road, and they're more popular now, but kind of fall out with the legislation as it was passed, I think.
I mean,
the vehicle styles have changed, and so they can't get registered as wedding cars, even maybe they've been bought off a wedding operator across the water who've been using it with no difficulty. Then it comes here and it's effectively redundant.
Well, I mean, the standards are, so that's a commercial decision as to whether you purchase a vehicle or not, and the standards that the vehicle has to meet are aware. And if you purchase a vehicle which you can't use for the purpose for which you purchased it, you still have that vehicle to do something else with or sell. It is an issue but the standards are there, and the standards are what they are, and they're there for the safety reasons. So as these things evolve, the standards are what they are.
And when it comes to enforcement, is it soft enough to touch then in circumstances like that where you'd see, well, jeepers, this isn't really the operator or owner's fault?
So we're a regulator. So the issue is to ensure that the vehicles are safe for people to get into and out of, and that they do. So I mean that is our concern.
We just have to accept. Rather than try and change.
On occasion there will be vehicles that will look pristine, but they have, for example, there's some, and it's maybe not just what you're talking about, Mark, but a situation where maybe a London taxi has come across, but it doesn't look anything like a London taxi now, and that vehicle can struggle, and in our view rightly can struggle to come into the industry because it has been changed so fundamentally, and we can't give the safety guarantees that we would need
to build on that. If a London taxi is built for a particular chassis and has a braking system, and again I'm straying outside my area of expertise here, but it is a braking system which is to brake the vehicle for the weight that is applied. If you then change the body substantially on that vehicle, you can increase the weight quite dramatically, and therefore also if it's subject, for example, to a collision from the side. Don't
get me wrong, now safety is paramount, but some of these issues seem more a question of style rather than safety. I
think that you meet the standards for the safety issues. That as the regulators you would expect, and I would hope that that's what we would say. We have standards that are there to protect the safety of the travelling public, and there are issues which, as Donald has pointed out, are not visible, but are so. Yeah,
100% in any vehicle.
We want vehicles to be, honestly, we really do want the vehicles to meet the standard and provide safe transport. That is what we want. Just to be really clear on that.
They all want that. At least the operators that are running the vehicles, I would hope.
Okay, Cahill, did you want to raise another?
Just now, I know Stephen's sitting over here in the corner. He's only been asked once a few questions, but I want to give him the last opportunity. No, just in terms of back to the reporting, the illegal stuff and all. How's that communicated to yourselves in the department? How do you get that message out? Say, I want to make a complaint about something.
Okay.
How's that communicated?
On the NI Direct website, you can log in, and it explains how to make a complaint about an illegal taxi operator. You can submit that using the email. There's also a telephone number that you can phone in confidence, and we invite and welcome people to use that and to step outside that fear. Any information that's conveyed to us is done in strict confidence, and it's important as well that where we can speak to the complainant to fill in the gaps, because sometimes what comes in is a rather banal complaint. There might be more to it that makes it easier for us to investigate. So certainly you can use the email address, and the telephone number is there as well, and as I say, by way of choice, to follow up with the email and speak to one of our officers is the ideal.
And your resource to deal with that, all right, yeah.
And we have a team specifically, and there's a proper structured model that operates under, and it's not dissimilar to other enforcement agencies.
Okay. Just to add a little bit, there's an actual complaints process on NI Direct, and it kind of takes you step by step through, in the first instance, maybe send your driver, contacting the operator if you don't get any satisfaction there, to then go to DVA.
Okay, thank you.
There's just as well, there's another process if you were a disabled person and had a complaint as well. Just to kind of the steps, there's guidance on NI Direct as well about how you would go through the kind of process to complain as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious that you are over your time now, and I do appreciate the fact that you've been here. Just very quickly, just to clarify, can you seize an unregulated car operating as a taxi?
Yes.
You can?
You can.
And you know, again, is that in the cases where you're seeing, for example, those Facebook posts touting for business?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the exercise of those powers, we have to have reasonable grounds to take that action. Anecdotally, just simply basing that on a complaint wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. We have a policy against which we will make those assumptions. If, for example, it's a mystery shopper and the evidence is obtained, it's relatively straightforward. But outside that, each case would have to be looked at on its own evidential merits. But in direct answer to your question, yes, we do have powers to seize an unlicensed taxi.
And then just, I suppose, from my own point of view too, I'm becoming aware from some people have actually tagged me on X or Twitter now, just in relation to on Saturday and Friday evenings around Belfast, the taxi ranks are, you know, people are parking in those. You know, where does that enforcement then come in? You know, when maybe, you know, the likes of red coats, etc., maybe, you know, off duty or that type of thing, or...
Yeah, I mean, from a DVA enforcement perspective, we have no jurisdiction over dealing with illegal parking. If the road is obstructed, there may be circumstances under which police might be able to enforceably have a vehicle removed, as an example. If there is a problem profile associated with the like of that, then the ideal would be to report that to the parking authority. And the only exception to the rule is that if a vehicle has gone on to the likes of the public hire rank and the driver's behind the wheel, it may be that we would construe that they're plying illegally for hire, and then we would deal with it using our own enforcement authority at that stage. But as I say, this parking of vehicles is, strictly speaking,
it is becoming a safety issue naturally, because obviously taxis are maybe having to stop, you know, if they're stopping on the road and people are trying to get in and out of cars and the taxi rank's full of parked cars. It's becoming a wee bit of an issue, but anyway, look, thank you for your time in committee today. We really appreciate all the evidence that you've given. There are a few points obviously to follow up on, just in relation to as well the consultation and whether the department, I think that was actually would be useful to see if the department think that that would be a good idea, you know, whether to take that forward. So it'd be useful if you were able to come back to us as soon as you can, just to see if you will be responding to it. And certainly as well for members, we have a bit of homework in relation to practicing online our own practical tests, and we'll maybe compare next week and see how we got on.
Go gaming, sure, we'll go gaming.
So thank you. We really appreciate your evidence today. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Yes, no. It's unusual with parking rents. You want it to be identified for 24 hours a day. Just on associated matter with the last briefing, yeah? I mean, it'd be interesting to ask the question of how, I mean, it seems strange to me how a parking rank wouldn't be identified as 24 hours a day, you know, 7 days a week. You know what I mean?
There just seems to be an issue there with, it seems to be particularly at the weekends.
Yeah, but say, but there has to be signage identified. It's say that, like,
well, I think signage is one thing, and I agree with you. I think signage is one thing, but I think the problem is actually in the enforcement of it. You know, I think the problem is trying to get people there to actually go this
approach. But if I live in the city and there's nothing to indicate to me that I could not park in a parking rank, my point is, when they legislate to identify parking ranks, there should be parking ranks per se, and that's it. It's like other than the taxi is allowed to pull into it, not an ordinary car. That's some city. So
I think we could
that's
maybe
That's a legislative thing. We'll have to.
We could maybe follow up on it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, Danny.
Just to follow up on that, it's the Class B stuff. Can we do a report or look into that there to see what the implications could be and recommendations from it?
On which, on
the
Class
fact,
B?
The fact that there's only 350 and what would the implications be for operators, and you know that keeps dwindling and it's really
They're
worrying.
actually the accessibility branch.
Yeah.
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 You get a
And
raise
their name, you know.
or ask
Yeah.
for more evidence or something.
Yeah. I
Okay.
think that's fair enough, because I do think it is an issue. Like I'd raised there about EA transport, and I know that's education,
Yeah.
but that is a huge
Absolutely.
issue.
Yep.
And you know, and if you are, you know, a person who needs to get to your work because, you know, and you're disabled, and you know, taxis as well for home to school transport in the mornings, and that's a massive issue.
Well,
So-
clearly, Mark said before, that's a real silo answer you got today.
Yeah.
It's not you know what I mean? They have to work those issues across, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I know it's difficult with budget, but those are the type of conversations we need to keep going, because that's one example of where it's not.
That was the point. Sorry, the point I was trying to get to, Chair, is how few would be too few.
Yes.
We've gone from 500 to 350.
Yeah.
In 4 years, it could be 100. In 4 years after that, could be 0, and then it's too late. So when does someone start taking action
And
to say there needs to be a minimum standard here?
We get them tack on or something.
Sorry.
Should we maybe get them tacky?
Yeah, I think, were they in communication? Were they? No. Yeah.
To take their point that look, they don't get extra money, that it might be an incentive for a taxi driver to take on that vehicle at extra cost, and people with disabilities shouldn't be charged anymore, so
Yeah.
there could be funding that needs to be looked at in that regard, but we can't let the number keep
No.
dropping down.
Yeah.
Definitely not. And then, as well as that, you know, like EA are bound to have modelling in terms of what they need, what their provision is going to look like, and all of that as well. Sorry, Mark, you looking back in?
No, I'd be entirely supportive
Yeah.
of doing a bit more on that. There's an admission there, and I think Dorcas's eyes almost lit up that there is a legislative route where something can be done.
Yes.
That's in terms of actual acquisition of vehicles, but it's the incentive to keep running those vehicles, even if we got the department to intervene and help drivers and firms buy them.
Yeah.
That needs, but also on the Class C stuff, I think we need to look at like that wedding and funeral cars. It's not that massive an issue, and there has been an acceptance across the department from day dot that they don't really belong there, but there does seem to be a sort of shrug your shoulders type approach to a lot of this.
It's the way it is type of thing. Yeah. Sorry, were you looking?
Yeah, unless someone else was to come in this bit, it was just to come back to the consultation. So I don't know if anyone else was, but I was a little bit taken aback when they announced that the consultation on the VAT stuff will be underway soon. But
Yes.
it didn't appear that it even dawned that would be something that would consider that the department would respond.
Yeah.
And it would. I mean, I always think maybe the committee should look at maybe responding to that. This is clearly a massive issue with potentially massive impacts on the sector, and I would have imagined that the department would have thought that would have been useful.
Yeah.
To at least get some of those concerns across, and would have engaged with Treasury. It's not all well and good saying it's a reserved matter, just shrug your shoulders. That's not an answer.
Yeah,
Someone needs to step in and at least articulate the arguments that are being made against the changes or the potential impacts for them.
I was glad you asked that actually, because I was on a similar vein of thought as well, because I was quite surprised that they weren't, from, you know, a Northern Ireland point of view, making some of the case in relation to some of the issues that had come up here. It'd be interesting to see whether they take that back and actually do work or bring something forward.
From a carrying weight point of view, individual operators will carry a little bit of weight, but a departmental response on behalf of the devolved government is pretty significant. And if other regions were doing the same thing and they engaged with counterparts in England and Scotland and Wales, and there was overlap in that response, you would think that might carry more weight than just a couple of people submitting a response about what concerns they might have. So hopefully something comes of that.
Yeah.
Just to follow up, because it's actually, as you listen to the conversation, it's slightly two different issues. One of them's a tax issue, but the very fact we may amend legislation here, that's the major factor. And that's the point we need to look at from the committee point of view. The very change after the rule in England, and they have to change taxi legislation in some respect. That's what's impacting on the tax issue.
Yes.
You know, to say that we all know it's HMRC issue in terms of tax. So for us as a committee, we'll just have to keep an eye and have a look at where that's the main issue for us, to be honest.
Well, look, in terms of committee, obviously what has been discussed today, and obviously I think we're all in agreement that we do think it's an important matter that they do respond to consultation. Maybe if members are content, we write as a committee, rather than wait for them to come back as well, that we write to them and say that we believe that actually this is a very important issue that they should be responding to in terms of consultation, just to try and push it along a wee bit as well. Are members content with that? Yeah. Okay. We'll move on if members are content.
We'll move on to Rachel.
Rachel, thank you for your patience there while you waited there in terms of our discussion from the last session. So, members, we're now moving on to item 8, which is the reclassifying of resource and capital expenditure assembly, research and information service briefing. And we're welcoming Rachel Keys today to the committee, who's a research officer with RAISE. So, thank you, Rachel, for coming to the committee today. Members, you'll be aware, obviously, that we had some evidence from TransLink. And so you'll have seen that in your papers, but we'll get a briefing from Rachel now just as an overview on it. Rachel, we do have obviously all of the written evidence there, so if you just give us a brief sort of overview of everything, and then we'll come to maybe members' questions after that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So the briefing paper in your packs at page 56 highlights the current governance and financial arrangements that are relevant to TransLink's overall use of public funds, and this was written in light of recent evidence sessions and related correspondence with the committee, and there are some initial observations to inform the committee's further consideration. I'll just first of all highlight a couple of the relevant context and then go into those initial observations. So it's important to note that TransLink is classified as a public corporation, and the Department for Infrastructure is its sponsoring government department. So generally, public corporations are governed in accordance with their constitutional documents. So, for example, there's no requirement for public corporations to follow the Government Financial Reporting Manual, which is known as FREM. They are, however, subject to Treasury's consolidated budgeting guidance. So we've listed a couple of the noteworthy provisions of that budgeting guidance, including things like the department is expected to set clear objectives and challenging targets in terms of return on capital, efficiency and quality of goods and services. Also, the need for the corporate plans of the public corporations should be subject to agreement with the department and then monitored. Also, if the public corporation is to perform a social policy function, then that should be paid for explicitly out of the budget, rather than seeking to recover the costs by either underperformance or through overcharging customers, and they're able to provide a subsidy to public corporations. In terms of capital grants, they're able to make capital grants which are unrequited transfer payments for investment by the public corporations, and these public capital expenditure should be monitored by the department. So TransLink is bound by a public service agreement as well as a partnership agreement with the department, and then annual corporate and business plans which are agreed during the corporate planning process. Just a couple of provisions within the partnership agreement between the department and TransLink which are noteworthy and outlined on page 63. So TransLink is required to follow principles, rules and guidance as set out in Managing Public Northern Ireland, with some minor amendments which are listed within the agreement. It's also required to follow due processes set out in guidance contained in the Better Business Cases Northern Ireland, which is a Department of Finance guidance. In addition, the ministers for the Department for Infrastructure is responsible, amongst other things, for setting the budget for TransLink. But once the budget has been approved by the department, TransLink has authority to incur expenditure approved within the budget without further reference to the department. However, there are a set of established delegated authority framework by DOF and the department that the TransLink needs to be aware of in order to incur any expenditure. So section 1.33 of the paper talks about Translink's financial arrangements. So the department annually provides capital and revenue funding to Translink. Just to make you aware of Whitehall's Department for Transport provided definitions for capital expenditure and revenue expenditure in the context of transport within one of their guidance documents. Those definitions are outlined on page 65 of the paper, and I'll just read them out. So in terms of capital expenditure, they say that this includes expenditure on capital grants and spending on assets such as the acquisition of land, buildings, vehicles and machinery. And for transport, this includes the cost of building a road or new rail lines and some maintenance work, which is important when we talk about this later on. In terms of current expenditure, this covers recurring spending on items such as pay, benefits and the purchase of goods and services. And for transport, this includes services such as concessionary fares and revenue to support public transport. So the department is Translink's primary source of capital funding, and it's also its second largest source of revenue funding. So it provides approximately 1/3 of the revenue income in recent years, and that's the rest of the income is mostly made up from passenger fares. If I turn your attention to Table 1 on page 71 of the paper, it just goes through the capital and revenue support from the department between 2018 and 2023, as well as its overall financial performance during that time. So the table shows that Translink incurred significant losses year on year between 2018 and 2020. In 2021, the Audit Office reported on the annual report and accounts for 2020-21 and said that Translink had incurred significant losses and depleted its cash reserves year on year since 2014-15. In 2021, Translink did report a profit of 38 million, and that was followed by a modest profit the following year of 0.4 million. However, in 2023, they reported a loss of 82 million, and in the committee session on the 20th of March, they reported a forecast loss of 17 million for last year. Moving on then to the initial observations, which is in section 3 of the paper. So as you know, there was some discussion on Translink's use of funds during the committee meeting on the 20th of March, and that was followed by some comments made from the department at the time, and then they followed up in writing as well. The actual comments are in section 2 of the paper, but I'm just going to draw out a couple of them to make some comments on them. So during that 20th of March committee meeting, a Translink official stated, and I'll just read the first one out, a lot of the maintenance of the rail network should come from resource funding, but we have not had the funding to do it. So we have tended to get a lot of out of it of our capital funding, which takes funding away from the capital plan. So as I noted in section 1.33 of the paper, that Whitehall Department for Transport definition for capital and current expenditure, that provides a really good benchmark for the types of public expenditure which could be classified as either capital or revenue in the context of transport. And the inclusion of the term some maintenance work under those definitions is particularly noteworthy in the context of that statement by Translink. It's also important to note at this point that Translink does not have a requirement to follow Government Financial Reporting Manual, which is FREM, as I noted earlier, but it is bound by international accounting standards, and these international accounting standards classifies expenditure as either capital or revenue. But it is bound by those standards. Later on in the same meeting, the Translink official talked through some of the steps involved, including economic appraisals, capital appraisals in terms of using using capital funding for maintenance. And it's just noteworthy here to point out that Translink is required to follow due processes laid out in Department of Finance guidance, including Better Business Cases Northern Ireland. So some of the steps identified by the Translink official, including the use of economic appraisals, are outlined within that guidance, and the committee may wish to note that those identified a process are to occur before any expenditure is made. So the requirement for the department to make approvals provide an additional layer of accountability in terms of this expenditure classification, because the department would be well within its rights not to approve any appraisals for capital funding if its officials thought that the expenditure should instead be classified as revenue. TransLink are also accountable to both their internal and external auditors in terms of this expenditure classification. You may also recall within the committee meeting, the department was able to respond to some of the comments. So they stated at one point, if TransLink is categorising something as capital, then it has to be able to defend that as capital. And if it categorises something as revenue, it would have to be able to defend it as revenue. So just a reminder that the department does have to approve the expenditure before the expenditure can occur, and that's done through this process of these appraisals. The department then followed up in writing, and they stated, and I'll just read this one out, that the TransLink's official statement was not in reference to accounting definitions, but rather an explanation of how a significant maintenance backlog has arisen due to constrained resource funding over at least a decade. This constrained funding has resulted in the deterioration of some assets to such an extent that normal maintenance interventions, which would have been resource funded, could not address or remediate the issues, and hence how this has created the need for capital projects which are then funded from capital. If I draw your attention to Section 5 of the Public Service Agreement between TransLink and the Department, it states that TransLink shall ensure that any capital expenditure which has a corresponding resource implication is reflected through the corporate planning process and in any relevant business cases. So if we think about this in this context, the committee may wish to note that if revenue implications are being effectively flagged at the business case stage and factored into this corporate planning process and corresponding budget allocations, then the use of capital expenditure for maintenance should indeed be limited. It's unclear from the information and data that was examined for this paper as to whether those resource or revenue implications are being reflected accurately within the business cases, or whether they are being reflected accurately but there's no budget that comes as a result of it, or whether that money is just spent on other pressures. Also, just to draw your attention back to that 2021 Audit Office report on the Department's annual report and accounts for 2020-21, where it stated that TransLink had incurred significant losses and depleted its cash reserves year on year since 2014-15. So TransLink reported a profit that year of 38 million, followed by a small profit the following year. But it is unclear from that report and from TransLink's annual report and accounts of the current or historic position of TransLink's cash reserves, and whether the reserves had been or could have been used more effectively going forward to ensure maintenance is addressed in a timely manner using revenue funding. So also just to draw your attention to the fact that public corporations have to follow Treasury's consolidated budgeting guidance. Within the guidance, it does say that PCs are not permitted to build up excessive cash reserves. So the guidance states that excessive would mean more than 3 years of an amount needed to fund expenditure in the next 3 years would classify as excessive. And then just very finally, just some recent comments by the Minister for Finance, because there was an additional 3 million of resource funding which went towards TransLink's reserves made on the 11th of April. And then during the committee meeting for finance, the Committee for Finance meeting on the 17th of April, the Department of Finance confirmed that an additional 12 million towards the reserves would be split between TransLink and DVA. However, the breakdown wasn't actually given at that time. So if you do have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you. Members, do you have any questions at this stage?
Thanks, Chair.
Sorry, I'm just going to go to the Deputy Chair here first.
No,
Sorry.
Any question?
Actually, normally we have a load of questions, but that was really comprehensive and a really good report. So it's just one thing I want to dive into is obviously you discussed how at times have been required to use resource funding for capital projects, and you outlined the reasons for that, particularly where projects are deemed so bad that the scale of the work takes into that. I'm just wondering if we continue on the cycle of funding in a 1-year budget, that sounds like it's more likely to continue and increase in the way that money's being moved, because a lot of the network is becoming more damaged and not being invested in. Is there any indication about how a 3-year budget, for example, would aid in assisting TransLink, and how much better things would be for them from a capital planning project point of view?
I think it's a case of, if we're at a stage where things are so bad that they have to be dealt with in a capital way, then absolutely a 3-year budget is going to be beneficial in order to do that, because generally for capital, that longer term planning is. But we also need to be mindful of, is there anything that we can be dealing with in terms of revenue of the stuff that hasn't gotten that bad yet? It's hard to understand if everything is at the stage where it needs to be capital, or if we're veering towards that and still not addressing things that could be dealt with in terms of revenue, and if either the reserve can be, or the cash reserves can be used for that, or if there needs to be more looked at in terms of the business cases at that point in time. Because I think, even during that evidence session, they are still buying buses, for example, every year. So next year, if buses need maintenance, we're not immediately going to go to the capital stage. We're going to hopefully go to the revenue stage. And so it needs to be addressed in two ways: the capital end of the stuff that's already being classified as capital, and then the revenue end, which is could still be classed as revenue if it's not left to the point that it's capital.
There's obviously a lot of capital big plans as well down the road. If we look at the All Ireland Rail Network and the amount of money that have to be spent on that, and electrification of the lines and decarbonisation of the fleet, and it almost feels a little bit abstract at the minute in terms of the money quite clearly isn't there without a long-term plan and a long-term financial model. So it's obviously something we need to be looking at, or they need to be looking at. Yeah. Thanks, that's really useful.
Can I just be clear in relation to if there is movement of, say, and I'm not suggesting that this is a case with TransLink or the department, but say, for example, there is money that is moving between capital and revenue and it hasn't followed the proper procedures, and that is picked up on, what sanctions then would be, just so that I'm clear, is there any sanctions, or what would be placed upon, say, a body like TransLink or the department if they're not reporting that in the way that it should be?
It would be flagged by the internal auditors, and then it would be flagged by the audit office, and then it would go through PAC as unqualified or a qualified opinion on their accounts. I don't believe any of that has actually happened for TransLink. But that's the process it would follow. So it would, I guess, end up at PAC through a qualified opinion from the auditor.
Okay, thank you. Cahill, you'd indicated there.
Thanks, Chair, and Grace, thanks very much for your presentation. Just want to delve a wee bit into it. And I appreciate the conversations around the multi-year budgets. But let's start with the business case. So what is the business case? 5-year plan, 3-year plan, or on?
They vary.
Right, they vary. Okay, so it clearly identifies then capital, unlike departments which is capital and resource deal, it can't be transferred over in cases, right? But obviously it's a different model what TransLink's operating on. So in your research, they've identified their programme right across both in capital and revenue. And I've seen here then, because it seems to me every year they're delving into reserves and they're moving money back and forward from resource and capital and back, which you can't do on the departments, right? Yeah.
I don't think they're moving money between the two. They're basically some of the maintenance.
Well, they're they have the ability to use it in different ways. Yeah.
They don't have the ability to use capital as resource and vice versa. They are submitting business cases for capital. It's been approved for capital and they're spending it for capital. There's some sort of queer, I read out those definitions from the Department for Transport just because transport's a little bit different from other types of expenditure, where some of the maintenance is capital, some of the maintenance is revenue. But they're not actually moving the money. They're being approved for capital and they're spending it on capital, or they're being approved for resource and they're spending it on resource. Right. They also get quite a 2/3 of their income doesn't come from the department, it comes from fares. So it's being used without sort of departmental input at all. But 1/3 of their revenue does come
well, it's
from
just
the
the way it reads in the paper. Well, tell me this then. What is the significant difference between it and the model that's operated by departments then?
The model operated by departments is public expenditure, so everything is either resource or capital. Once it goes to an ALB, they're basically submitting business cases for approval for expenditure. They're getting granted approval for expenditure. They're given a budget, and they're allowed to spend that budget on the things that they've had approval for.
Right. And then where's the obviously then the accountability mechanism you're saying is through public accounts or audit? Is that's the accountability? Yeah.
Yeah, they have to file annual report and accounts every year. Part of the grant that goes to TransLink forms part of the annual report and account for the department. That's looked at by internal auditors and external auditors, and TransLink's looked at by internal auditors and external auditors. The CNAG did a report on the 2021. I think that was the last time they looked at TransLink. So it is public expenditure, so it is subject to that. And there's sort of monthly returns that will go to Treasury, monthly expenditure, to make sure that it's not sort of going way above what it should be.
It's just I'm trying to get a better understanding of the model itself, how it works, because it's slightly different because we hear they can delve into reserves, and then obviously there's requests put in. You said 11 million on whatever date and thing, and then so in terms of reserves, then is that, I take it that's all built into the business model itself, because how do they bid for the certain sum each time unless it's within
public corporations are able to maintain cash reserves because they're business. They're operating as commercial businesses in part. So they according to the guidance, they can't build up excessive cash reserves. And part of the guidance also states that whenever the department is looking at its grant, they should be aware of the cash reserves. They can also do clawback. I don't think this has happened in the case of TransLink. No. But there are sort of mechanisms in place, just because there is public money involved, that they can't have excessive cash reserves. But they are able to build up cash reserves because sort of 2/3 of their revenue income comes from commercial business.
And is that based on a percentage of their overall assets in their bid in terms of reserves, or how does that work?
There's certain things that the department is responsible for paying for, and that's set out in the public service agreement. So I think there are things like the concessionary fares, and for like some transport is loss making because it's a social policy. So we have a social policy in place that we're going to have transport in rural areas, but they're not going to make money, so therefore the department is subsidising those rates. So there's certain things that TransLink or that the department pays for, and they are able to bid for each year, and it's all set out within the public service agreement in terms of revenue.
Right. Just my final point, because I was reading through what was said to the chair when she asked the question, because Chris was saying we move resource, but he's not moving resource. It's the way he explained it.
He doesn't have the ability to move it. Yeah,
it's just the way it come out in conversation. Mm-hmm. But thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, and I think that's probably part and parcel of why we were sort of asking the questions, because it was quite confusing. I suppose whenever we were sitting here and we thought, goodness, this seems a bit odd.
Yeah.
So, members, any further questions on this?
Very comprehensive as always.
Just the 12 million is now 13 million. There's a statement in there from the finance minister.
Which is embargoed. Which is embargoed until tomorrow.
So we don't know how much is. We don't know what goes
right,
to.
Okay, Richard. Thanks very much.
Thank
you very much. We really appreciate you coming to the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Trying to slip out.
Yes, no problem, Danny.
Well, Chair, that was useful, because if you read some of the answers in terms of, we know how the departments work in terms of capital and resource, slightly different, because you asked, I was reading the question you asked that day, and it come across a different way, you know what I mean? I'm not.
Yes, no,
that's good enough, yeah.
And it's good just for future as well, too. So, no, thank you, members, for that. So item 9 is the SL1, the Parkgate Avenue Belfast abandonment order. So we'll just go through these now. Yes, Parkgate Avenue Belfast abandonment order, Northern Ireland 2024. Page 82 is the SL1, the Parkgate Avenue Belfast abandonment order, Northern Ireland 2024. The rule will abandon an area of 23 square metres of road to the rear of the footway adjacent to number 12 Parkgate Avenue Belfast. The abandonment has been requested by a housing association to develop the site for social housing. The bed and the soil of the area to be abandoned is owned by the housing association, and following the abandonment, ownership will revert to the landowner. This rule is subject to negative resolution, so I'm asking members if they're content with the proposal for the statutory rule. Content? Okay, item 10 is a subordinate legislation SL1 not subject to assembly procedure. So I advise members that there are 3 proposals, SL1s for statutory rules that are not subject to assembly proceedings today. The statutory rules begin at page 85 of your packs. At page 86 is the SL1, the Road Races Spa Mount Hill Climb, Order Northern Ireland 2024. At page 88 is the SL1, the Parking Places and Waiting Restrictions Moy Amendment number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2024. And at page 91 is SL1, the Prohibition of Waiting Schools Amendment Order Northern Ireland 2024. Members content with the proposals for the statutory rules?
Content.
Okay, and then item 11 is subordinate legislation SRs not subject to assembly procedure. So advise members that there are 4 statutory rules which are not subject to assembly proceedings and are not required to be laid. The statutory rules begin at page 105 of the members' packs and at page 14 of the table pack. At page 105 is the SR 2024-91, the Road Races Northwest 200 Order, Northern Ireland 2024, and at page 115 is SR 2024-97, the Parking and Waiting Restrictions Larne Order, Northern Ireland 2024. And at page 124 is the SR 2024-98, the Waiting Restrictions Ballygally Order, Northern Ireland 2024. And at page 14 of the table pack is the SR 2024-96, the Parking and Waiting Restrictions Carrickfergus Amendment Order, Northern Ireland 2024. So are members content to note the statutory rules? Okay, thank you. And at item 12 is the Forward Work Programme, and you'll see there at page 129 is a draft Forward Work Programme. So I'm just seeking agreement that following the 2024-2025 budget announcement that the committee requests oral evidence from DFI at the earliest opportunity. Considering everything that's coming out in relation to it, and it'd be interesting to see where reserves and the breakdown of that as well. So seeking agreement to also request that DFI, so you're content to seek evidence on the budget, yeah. So then I'm also seeking agreement to request that DFI also provides the committee with a copy of the bid template submitted to the Department of Finance as part of the 2024-2025 budget development process. Are members content with that? I think it'd be useful to have that in advance as well. And then just to advise members that the Forward Work Programme obviously will be updated to reflect any decisions that are taken today. And I'm seeking agreement to proceed with the evidence sessions as set out in the draft Forward Work Programme. Members content? Yep. Yeah. Okay, so item 13, I'm just wondering, does any members have any other business that they wish to raise at this moment in time? No? Okay, thank you everyone for today and for another good session. I thought it was useful and interesting. So the date, time and location of the next meeting will take place here in room 29 of Parliament Buildings on the 8th of May at 10 a.m. So thank you, members. Now adjourn the meeting.
Committee Room 29, Sound. Committee Room 29, Sound. Committee Room 29, Sound. Committee Room 29, Sound.